One genre of literature you may have heard of before is historical fiction. What is historical fiction? This refers to a genre or a specific type of literature which is set in the past. The definition for this is kind of general. It basically means enough in the past that it would be included in your history book. So that might be at least 30 to 50 years in the past, but often historical fiction is set much longer ago than that. And historical fiction includes actual events from history and or real people from history. It may also include invented scenes and dialogue that the author created in their mind, and also believable, historically appropriate details, things that very likely could have been at the time the story is set. There are 6 characteristics of historical fiction that we're going to look at today, and how they play a role in historical fiction stories. The first is setting. This is considered the most important element of historical fiction because, of course, what makes it historical is that it was set in the past. And we know that setting refers to both time and place. So in historical fiction, the time is an authentic period in history. Historical fiction is not a story that's set in some made-up world sometime in the past. It's an actual authentic time period, a real historical place. So as you're reading historical fiction, you might consider, what is the setting? Make sure that you recognize it. Is it set, in the 1950s? Is it set during the Civil Rights era? Is it set during World War II? Make sure you can identify the time and place, and also how it relates to history. The second characteristic we're going to talk about today is characters. So the characters in historical fiction behave in realistic ways. They may be based on real people, or they may be fictional, but they're not going to be magical or something. The idea of historical fiction is that it gives us an eye or a window into the past, and so the characters will act in ways that are believable. Sometimes these characters are made up, but maybe they're based sort of loosely on someone who existed at that time. So as you read, you might consider which characters in the book are actual historical figures. Or in what ways do the characters behave as a result of when they were living and the culture that they were surrounded by. They may not do things or speak the way that we do today because of when they were living and the cultural expectations that were on them, the availability to resources that they had, all of those things dependent on where and when they lived can affect who they are and how they act. The third characteristic of historical fiction that you want to pay attention to is conflict. And conflict is central to anything that you read. So this is not unique to historical fiction. But the idea is that the conflict in a historical fiction book should generally be realistic to the time period. You're not going to have someone in a story set during the Great Depression who is battling with aliens, right? It's going to fit the time period. So as you read, consider, as you do with all literature, what is the conflict? What is the problem that is driving the plot? And also, what type of conflict is it? Is it an internal conflict where they are struggling with something within themselves? Or is it an external conflict where our protagonist is being foiled by someone else or battling some kind of struggle outside of them? When we think about the plot of historical fiction, it is typically a mix of real events and fictional events. So the author will perhaps write about a battle that actually happened, but then also include events that didn't happen. And this helps to move the plot along. It helps to create their own unique story. But these things that happen, even when fictional, should make sense to the time period. And they'll have a solution to the problem at the end, typically. So as you read, you want to consider how the author uses real events from history, or how they alter or change real events from history to tell the story. They might speed up the way that things actually happened so that it fits better in a book and the pacing is more interesting. But there are lots of ways that they might alter or adjust history. And then also think about how the plot is affected by the setting. Because of when and where this took place, what are characters having to deal with? In historical fiction, descriptions are typically very vivid. There's a lot of description in historical fiction so that you can really put yourself in that place or in that character's shoes. Historical information that we may not be familiar with is often covered by the writer so that we understand where they're coming from, right? If it's set a long time ago, it's likely that there are things we don't really understand or that we're not familiar with, that we don't have experience with. And so the author wants to describe it in such a way that you're still able to picture it and understand it. So think as you read about what strategies the author uses to do that. What do they do in their writing to make the characters come alive and to make it so that you can imagine these events and places that they're describing? And lastly, dialogue. When you look at how the characters are speaking and thinking, consider that because this is set in the past, it's going to be different, understandably, from today. So their words that they're speaking, but also their thoughts, are going to reflect what they knew at that time in history, and what was important to them and that they valued at that time, and generally what was common at that time. So you might consider how characters speak similarly or differently from people in our society today. You might consider what knowledge they didn't have at that time that we do now. Did they treat medical conditions the same way? Did they have the same understanding of, our planet? There are lots of things, particularly relating to science, right? But in general, that at certain times in history, they thought of very differently than we do today. And that affects then how they live their lives. So as you read historical fiction, look at this as a nice narrative, storytelling way to get familiar with a time period that is very removed from us. And it's an opportunity to get familiar with the past in a really engaging way.